So firstly, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy days to come along to this webinar. We're absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you about these new greenwashing rules. And before I get started, and most importantly, before I forget, we've had a couple of questions come in by email before today. So we're going to deal with those throughout the presentations or at the end. But if anyone has any questions during the presentation, then please use the question function in Zoom. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question or you want to chat to us about something in more detail, please do get in touch with us. Myself, Ian and Rebecca are more than happy to fix up a Teams call with you to discuss any issues. So if you need any help, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Right, Mark, first slide, thank you. So I wanted to start my part of the presentation with a pretty serious health warning, so here you go. This whole story is completely true, except for all the parts that are totally made up. Now that's the disclaimer which appeared at the start of every episode of the Netflix series Inventing Anna, but I think it fits the bill quite well in terms of a disclaimer for my part of the talk. My introduction is going to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is to try to get you all thinking. And for those of you who've heard me present before, you'll know that I don't mind being a tad controversial or of having an opinion, but I do ask that you take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt. It's meant to be thought-provoking as opposed to serious legal advice. But I should also say that my co-presenters, Rebecca Ironmonger from my team here at Roythornes, and Ian Thomas, who's kindly agreed to present with us today and who is a barrister from Gough Square Chambers, absolutely do not endorse or agree any of what I'm about to say. I also want to say that this topic is absolutely huge, and when Rebecca and Ian come on to talk to you about the proper law, while Rebecca's going to give you an overarching view of the current position and some of the changes that might be on the horizon, and while Ian is then going to be honing in on a few of the key areas where he can foresee that legal disputes might arise, it's impossible for them to cover every possible angle during this short webinar. But what's certainly become very clear to me as part of my preparation for this talk is just how difficult a task you guys have ahead of you. This is going to be an ever-growing area of law, and it isn't going to go away. And if anything, the rules are going to become more and more stringent and more complicated over time. And the need for you to keep ahead of the curve and properly consider any environmental claims you're making is very real. There's going to be no get out of jail free card on any of this. You can't just decide this is all too complicated or too burdensome. We're not going to make any environmental claims. That's already potentially a problem because in saying nothing, you can be found to be green hushing. And in any event, consumers want this information. So there's an obligation on you to be thinking about it and a need for you to be doing it. But Europe already intends to make their rules binding on everyone. So you must make a claim and that claim must be accurate. And the general feeling is that that requirement is likely to be implemented in the UK in the future, albeit that it's not on the cards yet. Next slide, thank you. For those of you who attended our food business breakfast in February, you will have heard Jack Bobo speak. Now, Jack was appointed Director of the University of Nottingham Food Systems Institute in July 2023, and his online bio describes him as an esteemed thought leader with a unique background spanning international law, food and environmental policy, and behavioural science. And I'll put my cards on the table and be totally honest with you. It was Jack's very thought-provoking talk that really got me thinking about this topic from a totally different perspective. Next slide. We need to produce 25% more food than we do now by 2050. That's unavoidable. If we don't do that, then people are going to starve. Now, the upshot of Jack Bobo's presentation, and I hope I'm not doing him a disservice in summing it up in this way, was that as a global world, we will be able to produce 25% more food by 2050. And crucially, we can do that in a way that does not totally destroy the planet, although the destruction of the planet is still a very real option for us as a human race. The key to producing more food which does not threaten the planet is to do so through innovation. The EU's farm to fork strategy will reduce pesticide risk by 50%, fertiliser use by 20%, and expand organic production by 25%. But all of that means that the EU will produce less, and therefore the rest of the world will be required to make up the difference. the EU will simply import whatever additional food they need as a result of their loss of production following the implementation of their new environmentally friendly measures. So in effect, what they will do is cause environmental harm elsewhere in the world at the expense of them adopting a more sustainable approach within Europe. And so if you adopt environmentally friendly farming in one place and you use less pesticide and less fertiliser, then you will on the face of it appear sustainable and the benefits will be felt locally. But as you produce less food, and there's a reason that farmers use pesticides and fertilisers, then someone somewhere else in the world has to produce more, likely using unsustainable methods to make up the difference. For example, one of the most unintended consequences of the EU's farm to fork strategy is the disruptions it could bring to Africa and other vulnerable regions who are likely to face the brunt of the inevitable shortfalls of European food production. But the inescapable truth is that as a global world, we need to produce a certain amount of food each year to feed the world population, and we need to produce more food, not less, by 2050. And so passing this responsibility elsewhere is, in my view, both irresponsible and immoral, as is telling other countries in the world that we won't buy their products anymore because they don't adopt what we say are good environmental practices. And in terms of palm oil, I think the quote from Malaysia's Environment Minister, which is on the slide there, which was made in recent days coming out of the recent WTO decision in the EU-Malaysia palm oil dispute, just about sums it up. He said, "We're not questioning the need to fight deforestation, but it's not fair when countries that have deforested their own land for centuries or are responsible for much of our deforestation can unilaterally impose conditions on us." And so I think what the Malaysian Environment Minister is saying, and quite rightly in my view, is it's not fair, Europe, now that you're developed and wealthy, having used or even required the deforestation of our country to get there, to take the moral high ground and simply ban unilaterally the imported products we're producing. And that's particularly the case in the case of palm oil, because palm oil was once hailed as the new super crop because of its purported environmental benefits. And to add weight to the view that what Europe is doing is morally wrong is the fact that many have hailed these EU rules as a form of economic protectionism and a way to shield European farmers who grow crops that compete with palm oil, such as rapeseed or soybeans. And that was certainly the view of the one dissenting judge in the WTO. Next slide, thanks, Mark. So just to give you a balanced view in terms of the EU farm to fork strategy, this was unprecedented in terms of what it covers and what it's seeking to achieve. It was the first of its kind to attempt to marry all elements in the food chain: agricultural, ecological, and nutritional, and food sustainability was the key aim. But sustainability and food security are polarised, and issues such as COVID, as well as the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, have underlined the need for food security. And while sustainability is a key part of food security, it's not the only relevant factor. And sustainability, no doubt because it's a long-term goal and aspiration, and particularly because there's still no general consensus on what is sustainable, is never going to trump food security. The need and obligation to feed people and to have enough nutritious food available will always trump environmental considerations. And it seems that EU leaders have heeded the concerns raised by the opponents to their strategy, as no proposals for the implementation of sustainable food systems have been forthcoming from the Commission. Instead, there is now a move towards strategic dialogue in the hope of overcoming polarisation. And I would agree that the EU strategy was premature and that a great deal of further work is required before such an ambitious strategy can be advanced. I suspect that the reason these plans have been shelved is because of food security issues, as opposed to the EU having suddenly found its conscience and heeded warnings about the rest of the world having to pick up the tab for their environmental goods. But having said all of that, I think the EU is to be applauded for its efforts. Climate change is a very real and very immediate problem that the world needs to address, and there's a lot of good that can be taken from their strategy, and it certainly does form a very good base for future strategic discussion on these issues. Next slide, thanks, Mark. I'm sure you'll be aware there's been a lot in the press in recent weeks about the unprecedented rain that we've had and the impact that this has had on both British farming and farming across Europe. And farming groups have confirmed that this record-breaking rain has drastically reduced the amount of food produced in the UK. The UK will be reliant on imports of wheat in the current year and possibly for longer because of the drastic reduction in yields. And that means that the price of staple foods such as bread are likely to rise. But what does that mean for food producers who are reliant on UK wheat in their products? Those food producers will be required to import this from elsewhere and buy from different suppliers to the ones that they would ordinarily use. And the very fact of importing, at least potentially, has environmental consequences. But moreover, how does a UK food producer who has worked out the environmental claims that it wants to make about its products based upon the use of UK wheat from a local farmer deal with his environmental claims? Is he required to change them or remove them? Or can he provide an explanation that this year we won't be meeting those claims because of X, Y, and Z? It seems very unfair that climate change, as a result of the historic actions of the global world, means that food producers reliant on UK crops are not able to make the environmental claims that they would have been able to make but for climate change, the very thing that doing good for the environment is seeking to address and improve. Next slide, thanks, Mark. So what greenwashing is actually happening, and what is the Competition and Markets Authority's position in relation to environmental claims? The International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, which is made up of consumer protection authorities from around the world, hosts an annual sweep of websites which gives consumer authorities across the world the opportunity to target fraudulent, deceptive, or unfair conduct online. Now, the CMA and the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets led the sweep conducted in 2020, focusing on misleading environmental claims for the first time in sectors such as clothes, cosmetics, and for our purposes, food. So in doing this sweep, members found that 4 in 10 websites appeared to be using tactics that could be considered misleading and therefore potentially break consumer law. So these sorts of things included vague claims and unclear language, including terms such as eco or sustainable, or reference to natural products without adequate explanation or evidence of the claims. They found own brand eco logos and labels not associated with an accredited organisation. And they also found the hiding or omitting of certain information, such as a product's pollution levels, to appear more eco-friendly. And so you can see why the regulators have got their knickers in a twist over this. There's a need to introduce new rules because greenwashing is rife. But if we look at the quote from the chief executive of the CMA, which is on the slide, too many websites appear to be pushing misleading claims onto consumers, which means that companies offering products with a genuine environmental benefit are not getting the customers they deserve. People should be able to easily choose between those companies who are doing the right thing for the environment and those who are not. So the problem for me is, what does doing the right thing for the environment actually mean? There's no agreed view on it. And against a backdrop of we need to produce 25% more food by 2050, and against a backdrop of absent real innovation in producing sustainable food in one place, unsustainable food must be produced elsewhere, how do you assess what is good for the environment? We all need to eat. There must be enough food to feed everyone. Some people will be in a position where they can both afford to eat and will have access to environmentally friendly produced food. Others will not. Just in the same way that some companies will be able to produce environmentally friendly food and others will not. And indeed, in terms of food production, we mustn't forget that as things presently stand as a global world, we need food to be produced unsustainably in order that we can feed ourselves. And so if all of these companies and all of these consumers are necessary in order that we can feed the world, why should we criticise either the companies who are unable to produce or the consumers who are unable to afford to consume sustainable food? And why should the companies who can produce sustainable food and the consumers that can choose to buy it be praised, when all that means is others in the world are disadvantaged by their good choices? Next slide, thank you. And so now we've got to add into the mix the fact that it's consumers who are going to be reading these claims and making decisions about whether to purchase products as a result. And let's face it, consumers have got absolutely no understanding of where their food comes from or how it's produced. And certainly they've got no idea at all about what is and what isn't sustainable. Now, that really isn't very surprising, given that the governments and regulators of the world are unable to agree on this. But nevertheless, it's a very real problem that you guys are going to have to navigate. So although we live in a time where consumers are making more demands of food producers than ever before, and environmental goods and sustainability are key demands they're making, consumers don't in reality understand the demands they're making, and they certainly have no idea that their demands are not delivering the results they believe they will. Just because a consumer buys something which is responsibly or sustainably produced doesn't mean that they should feel all warm and fuzzy inside, because in all likelihood, all they have done in purchasing an environmentally friendly product is to kick an environmental problem over to someone else in the world. Absent innovation, any gain made by good environmental practice will be lost by necessary unsustainable environmental practice somewhere else. Next slide, thank you. And so my question is, shouldn't all eco-labels on food make clear what I've been saying? I'm not sure that many people would be rushing to make a claim like the one I've put on the slide. Next slide, thanks, Mark. And so we face a dichotomy. In the absence of innovation, any sustainably produced food will mean unsustainable food produced somewhere else. Perhaps the real focus of claims should therefore go to what improvements a particular company has made in terms of its production and/or footprint without causing harm elsewhere. Merely to adopt a strategy like the EU's farm to fork strategy just kicks the problem to somewhere else in the world. Now, if the EU could adopt those new environmental practices and still produce the same amount of food, then that would be a different matter. It is innovation, that is the production of the same amount of food or more food without the environmental harm, which is key. So for me, environmental claims shouldn't be about saying that your product is fantastic in isolation. They should be about all the ways in which you strive to improve the environment of the world overall. Jack Bobo was very clear that it's still open to the human race to save the planet, but he was equally clear that it's still open to us to completely destroy it. And while it isn't the food industry on its own that can resolve all of these problems, agriculture and food production are the industries which not only comes under most fire for being the industry that is responsible for destroying the planet. Absent real change, inevitably, unsustainable food production will have a key role in bringing about that destruction. So for me, all of these new rules on greenwashing, and indeed all the rules that we're already subject to, are premature, at least when it comes to making green claims in respect of food. We are not yet in a position where all food can be produced in a way that does not harm the planet. As we all need to eat, it isn't right or fair to criticise those who are doing what needs to be done to feed the world population. But unfortunately, I don't make the rules, and these new rules are coming. And so against that backdrop, I'm now going to hand over to Rebecca, who's going to fill you in on what the current position is and what those new rules are going to look like.
Thank you, Hannah. That was a little bit controversial, wasn't it? Next slide, please, Mark. I'm now going to give my own disclaimer that everything I set out now applies only to England and Wales, and given the time constraints, as Hannah explained earlier, I will only be giving a brief overview of a small corner of the current law and potential changes. Ian will be expanding on some of the points I make later. So, what does the law look like now? It is currently voluntary, whether you make environmental claims about your products or your business. However, if you do make any environmental claims, then those claims will be the subject of scrutiny and must comply with the current requirements for such claims. Environmental claims can be reviewed by various regulators in different circumstances, including the Advertising Standards Agency, the Competition and Markets Authority, local authorities, and trading standards. Those bodies may also bring enforcement action where claims do not comply with the current rules. This is a huge topic, and as we said earlier, we cannot cover the whole of it in this short webinar. I will therefore be focusing on the CMA and its rules and powers. One of the recent introductions from the CMA has been the Green Claims Code. Next slide, please, Mark. The Green Claims Code contains the basic guidelines which any environmental claims must comply with, and is the measure against which the CMA will assess claims when carrying out its investigations. This applies to claims made about any part of your business, your services, your products, or your brands. The key requirements of the Green Claims Code are that claims must be accurate, clear, up to date, be fully backed up by credible and up-to-date evidence. They must reflect the entire life cycle of the product, brand, business, or service. And that is what Hannah was talking about in terms of how difficult it is going to be to comply. And they must also be easily accessible to consumers and not mislead, make omissions, or exaggerate. At first blush, that seems relatively sensible, albeit very onerous. But as Ian will explain later, it is not as simple as this list makes out. When carrying out some research for this webinar and having a look at many of your websites, some of you are already taking advantage of accreditation schemes for environment-related matters. There are a number of different accreditation schemes out there, all with different criteria, which will help to fulfil some of the Green Claims Code requirements, but may not with all. We've had a question about accreditation schemes, which I will deal with later towards the end of the webinar. With all the issues Hannah and I have talked about so far in relation to making green claims, is there any other help available for you to work out what you can say? It was in the media recently that a university in America is developing an AI model, which will, if it delivers on its promises, allow environmental claims to be analysed and for companies to work out whether their claim is accurate. It is likely, given how important this topic is, that other AI models are in development across the world to work out properly the environmental impact of certain actions. This would be particularly useful if a model was able to work out all of the issues that Hannah mentioned with the displacement of environmental impacts on food production from one part of the world to another. But that is perhaps something for the future. Next slide, please. Given the many current issues with environmental claims, what changes are on the horizon for greenwashing and the CMA in particular? Currently making its way through Parliament is the Digital Marketing, Competition and Consumers Bill, which, among other things, some of which Ian will briefly discuss shortly, will introduce greater, more wide-ranging powers to the CMA to enforce breaches of consumer law, including environmental claims. These new powers will include the power to issue enforcement notices and impose monetary penalties of up to £300,000 or 10% of global turnover, whichever is the higher. At the moment, the CMA are only able to investigate environmental claims and other claims that you make about your products, and also accept undertakings from businesses where breaches are discovered. In the most serious cases, prosecutions can already be brought by regulators under other regulations. This will not change following the introduction of the Digital Marketing, Competition and Consumers Bill. But the new powers will provide a middle ground for the regulator, where they deem breaches to be not serious enough to warrant prosecution, but too serious not to impose a penalty. We will have to wait and see how the new powers are utilised, but it is worrying from a business perspective, as you could be subject to a monetary penalty which ends up being larger than any fine you would get if you were prosecuted. It is likely that any guidance that is issued will be issued perhaps many months after the bill has been introduced. Next slide, please. As greenwashing is a relatively recent issue, there have not been a large number of investigations by the CMA so far, and there have not been any CMA investigations on this topic in the food sector. One of the investigations that has reported very recently is the ASOS, Boohoo and Asda investigation into environmental claims made about their clothing products. This investigation gives a useful insight into the CMA thinking in this area, and also will apply to the food sector. The result of the investigation was that the CMA found that the claims those companies made were misleading, as they did not contain enough information in the information given, and also that information was not evidenced. The companies have signed undertakings or agreements with the CMA following this investigation that all future claims they will make will comply with specified criteria. Some of the criteria include that green claims must be accurate and not misleading. Key information must be clear and prominent. Statements about fabrics must be specific and clear. For example, organic or recycled would be acceptable, whereas ambiguous terms like eco, responsible or sustainable without further information would not be. The terms recycled or organic must themselves comply with certain criteria, including how much of the product is composed of organic or recycled material. A company's environmental targets must also be explained with a clear and verifiable strategy, with more details publicly available than there are at the moment, including what the target is aiming to achieve and the target date and how the company will seek to achieve that target. Most of these criteria can be applied very easily to food businesses and any environmental claims you make. Another point to note is that the CMA published an open letter to the fashion industry when it published the findings of the investigation, which included confirmation that monetary penalties may be imposed once the Digital Marketing Competition and Consumers Bill is passed for claims such as those in the fashion industry investigation going forwards. This gives a useful insight into their thinking at the moment and in the future. The Digital Marketing Competition and Consumers Bill is currently at its final stages in Parliament, but there is no current estimate of when it will receive royal assent. I've given you a very brief whistle-stop tour of what's going on at the moment. Ian is going to now delve a little deeper into that, so I'm going to pass you over to Ian now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Hannah and Rebecca, and also thank you to Mark, who is doing all the background work, for the invitation to speak with you this morning on what is an incredibly vast subject, but is an incredibly important one, and will only continue to get more important. So could you put the slide on for me, Mark, please? Thank you very much. So before we get on with the slides that I've presented, I think it's important that when we're talking about, excuse me, environmental claims, as food lawyers or as people in the food sector, we make claims all the time about other things. We make claims about health claims. We make claims about nutrition claims. We make claims about all sorts of things. And when we look at it, we have to consider whether what we're saying might state or suggest or imply something. So when we're talking about environmental claims, if we make an observation, a statement, a claim, what are we actually saying? But what are the implications for what people might take from what we have actually said? The other thing that I find interesting, predominantly from a food law and a consumer product law perspective, is this: a number of things that are possibly food environmental issues. Hannah mentioned pesticides. Which means that there will be scrutiny from authorities, and Rebecca's mentioned a few of those, but also commercial competitors. So commercial competitors that want a level playing field. Interested people, interested organizations, environmental groups, if you will. But also, who's going to judge your claim? Well, hopefully you will, because you are the responsible business. You are the one that is making the claim. You are the one that is trying to promote what you think is a positive aspect to your business or to your product or to your processes. So whilst there's going to be, as Rebecca's alluded to, obviously, scrutiny from lots of different people, you ultimately are responsible. So therefore, you ultimately need to consider what it is you're saying, and is it going to be misleading, or might it be misleading? Is it truthful? So there are a lot of things that will come into play when we look at who will judge your claim. Before I deal with the final bullet point on that slide, the average consumer, of course, in a broader perspective, the people that are judging your claims are ultimately policymakers, lawmakers, politicians. From Europe, the Green Deal, we've heard the farm to fork strategy. It's whatever is the current vogue, the current thing that's in favor from an environmental perspective. But when we then look at, once those rules have been made, once those codes have been implemented, once that law has been passed, predominantly what we're looking at is the protection of this notional consumer, the notional consumer that requires protection. And that's often just referred to as the average consumer. So it's the average consumer that these regulations and rules are trying to protect. The next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. So who is this average consumer? Now, I obviously don't know the lady that's in the slide, but I'm sure she is to represent all of us as the average consumer. And we have average consumer in European legislation, also in domestic legislation. And one thing that has happened in UK case law on labelling particularly is, would a reasonable consumer be misled by whatever it might be? Now, whilst as the average consumer, we are all individuals and we all want different things. So if you're a consumer whose purchasing decision or your transactional conduct is based on an interest in the composition of the food, you might look to the list of ingredients. If your interest is on a health claim or a nutrition claim or whatever it is, you might be focused on that part of the label or the information that's provided. If, therefore, you are interested in the environmental side of things, you're going to look directly for the environmental claim. So, in a sense, we're looking at the average consumer, but the consumer is going to be wanting something quite specific. And it's all that thing about making those decisions. But ultimately, what we are looking to achieve in terms of law, of regulation, of codes, of the way we do business, is to provide information to enable the consumer, the average consumer, to make what we call informed decisions. And within the food context, that's nothing new, because that's the purpose of the Food Information to Consumers regulation. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that whilst environmental claims are very, very important and they're incredibly difficult to make without being potentially misleading, the thought process is one that we're already used to in the food sector. But it does mean we now have to put on a very different viewpoint and adding to what we already do. So the average consumer, it talks about reasonably well informed and reasonably observant and circumspect. But are consumers interested? We will have a group of consumers that are actually uninterested in what the product is telling us. Because what they're actually interested in is, can I get my particular food at a particular price? You will also then have the very interested consumer or consumer group, and they will be the ones that will be scrutinizing these environmental claims in the same way that all other claims are scrutinized by, if I can loosely call them, sort of interest groups. There are groups of consumers that are easily swayed by something that we say as businesses. So you are focusing on a particular interest for a particular group of people. We know, because there's lots of surveys, that environmental issues are becoming more important to consumers. There are polls, you can pick a poll if you want and pick up a result that says X% are more interested in the climate, the environment, reducing meat consumption, whatever it might be. So the concept of this average consumer reasonably well informed and reasonably observant and circumspect is by definition a movable feast, because we judge reasonableness by the current standards, the current interests. And if consumers are becoming more environmentally savvy, more environmentally aware, for whatever reason that is, then the average consumer is changing. And if they are becoming more knowledgeable of environmental the situation, of claims, of the current policy, then the reasonably well-informed and reasonably observant and circumspect consumer is that one now that has that arguably enhanced environmental knowledge. So we can't bluff the consumer, not that we would anyway, but we have to be very careful how we present our information. Mark, the next slide, if you would, please. Thank you. So we've judged from the average consumer's perspective, but how now will your claim be judged? Well, we all know that we have to work within rules, legal rules, legislation. So what I've just put on this slide are just a little bit of the legal provisions that we have in order to use in order to make our green claims lawful and not misleading. Within the EU, you'll all be familiar that the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive has been amended by Directive 2024/825, which will from September 2026 have specific requirements to deal with environmental claims as they will be defined. It's the bit that's going to get rid of all this carbon neutral claiming and things of that nature. Okay, so European level, we have this general Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which has been amended to focus on environmental claims. Parallel to that, in the European context, we have the proposal for this Green Claims Directive. And I mentioned a few minutes ago about having to work within policymakers who are going to set the rules. And the European Commission is saying, look, we need to now empower consumers so that they can actively contribute to this green transition. So what we are looking to do as policymakers, as lawmakers, is to actually say, if you're going to make a green claim or environmental claim, then you must have the correct substantiation for it, in order that the consumer reading it can have confidence that the claim is correct. And that if they choose to purchase that product rather than another product, they are purchasing it for the right reasons. So they're not being hoodwinked into purchasing a product because it has a green claim. That is not true. So at European level, a lot of changes. I'm not going to deal with the pros and cons of Brexit, other than to say that's at the European level. Within the UK, the 2008 consumer protection regulations, which are based on the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. And they set out all the things about unfair commercial practices, misleading practices, which could be a misleading positive action or a misleading omission. Rebecca's already mentioned the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill, and she's absolutely right. We don't know when it's going to get royal assent, but the general feeling is it'll be towards the sort of the autumn, early winter of this year. What that bill will do, fundamentally, based on what I'm talking about at the moment, will revoke the 2008 regulations. So we are going to have to learn whole new set of laws, albeit based on what the 2008 regulations currently require. Rebecca's indicated also that there's now going to be the opportunity for enhanced investigation, and notices can be served and financial penalties can be imposed, £300,000 or 10% of turnover, turnover being both UK and outside UK. So it's a situation in which if we are, as an individual business or as part of a group of businesses or a sector or an industry, if we come under scrutiny, then it's not good for business. Rebecca's mentioned the Asda ASOS Boohoo investigation. The CMA is showing that it has teeth and it will take action to protect consumers. I mentioned earlier on, I think, about things like pesticides and environmental and food safety, but we also have the general food information requirement that food information should not be misleading, which is in the information to consumers regulation and the food information regulations within GB. So we have those two legislative sets of provisions, EU and UK. But then there are the codes, the ASA and the CMA. So we've got all those guidelines, if you will. We've got all the things that will help us. But actually, when we come down to prepare our claim, we have to look at that very, very individually. What are the words that we're using? What's the context? Are we using logos? How are we placing that information on a label? Are we giving prominence to something? And if so, when the consumer looks at the product label, for example, what is it that's jumping out at them? Are we trying to say to them, look, please look at our green claim? And Rebecca's already outlined some of the things that's in the CMA guidance. And it all makes perfect sense. But until we actually look at our individual claim, it's very difficult to know whether or not it's going to be the right or the wrong side of the line. So lots of things to assist, but ultimately it's got to come down to a decision maker who puts themselves in the feet or the shoes of the average consumer. Next slide, Mark, please. So my final slide really is just trying to look at some of the challenges for businesses. And I don't know who's on the call. And if there are regulators on the call, then some of these challenges will apply equally to you. Because ultimately somebody is going to judge the claim. So, as I say, where are we making the claim? What's the context? Somebody's going to be reviewing our claim. But, and again, the CMA is right to say this, but in the CMA code, it says this: if you follow the code, and this is a quote from the code, you are less likely to mislead and are less likely to fall foul of the law. Less likely. So it's one of those classics. If you say, well, I was following the code, I was following the guidelines that we were given, but ultimately even doing that is not a surefire guarantee of success. So what I can envisage happening, and this happens to me quite a lot, is there's going to be this tension between marketing and legal. And as we know, legal are the ones that always say no, because that's what we're supposed to do. So that's going to happen again. We frequently have it in things like health claims and other type of food information. So therefore, us as a business, are we aware of the risks? Are we risk averse? What is our overall compliance culture? There's the food safety culture, but what is our compliance culture? So are we self-aware? Are we self-critical? Are we self-challenging? Do we know our business? Do we understand it? Do we understand it in the context now of these environmental claims? Do we understand the implications of changes that we are proposing to make? So I had a situation in which a business wanted to make environmental claims about how they produced a product and saying there was fewer pesticides, we used less water, etc., etc. but they expanded their market. So instead of selling within a, I don't know, 50-kilometer radius, they were then selling into other countries. So their transport footprint got bigger. And again, you need to be very clear how changes are going to impact on the business. So what we are, as we should do anyway, is we are trying to create this pre-claim substantiation, which means a thorough self view of the business and what we're going to do. There might be the relevant authority who's going to be the one that's going to come after us, if anybody, or might it simply be a consumer complaint or a competitor complaint? I think finally we look at those consequences, but also what's really important, and this is where it puts the pressure on the smaller businesses, the SME, and sometimes the larger one. But this is just another thing that we have to focus on. And it's very easy to focus on the current thing and forget everything else that we're having to do. So don't forget everything else that we have to do as businesses to protect consumers, both in terms of safety and in terms of what information we provide for them. And if anybody after this wants any assistance, you know, as you've been told, you can come to us. But if you've got a few minutes during the course of the day, which I'm sure you all have, you can look at the Green Claims Campaign website, and you can take a short multiple choice question on the Green Claims Code. So you can have a sense yourself as to whether or not you are okay with what's going on, understand what's going on. It's only a few questions, but it's something that actually, I think, one, will assist the thought process. But I think as I did the quiz, it makes you realize just quite how big this topic is. That is not meant to scare you. It's meant to be a reality check. And on that reality check, I think I've come to the end of my allotted time. So I'll hand you back to Hannah or Rebecca. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think that you've managed very cleverly to deal with the two questions that we had in via email before. If we haven't answered those, then please do get in touch with us though. But I think, Rebecca, we're going to deal with a question to do with certifications. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So the question we've had is, can you rely on an accreditation scheme who has certified you as carbon neutral or plastic neutral or similar when making a claim? So the short answer to that, unfortunately, is no. Without further information explaining the claim of carbon neutral or plastic neutral or whatever your claim is, and without ensuring that the claim is fully accurate and up to date for yourselves, you cannot just rely on a badge certifying you as complying with the accreditation scheme. There has been a recent food and drink sector decision by the Advertising Standards Agency against Brewdog PLC. They posted on Instagram a post which claimed their business to be carbon negative, and the post included a badge with the text "Positive Planet Certified Carbon Negative Company." The post also contained the line stating followers should use the link in the bio for further information. The Advertising Standards Agency ruled that without the qualifying information explaining the carbon negative claim in the ad itself, the ad was misleading. The use of the accreditation badge was, according to the ASA's ruling, not sufficient to make the basis of the environmental claim clear because it did not provide information in the ad on the basis for the carbon negative claim. This highlights that any claim you make must be substantiated and accompanied by evidence, and an accreditation badge will not be enough. Certification by an accreditation scheme could, however, be excellent mitigation should enforcement action be taken against any claim made. It will also give you a very good basis for working out whether your claims are accurate or not, because the accreditation schemes may have more resources at their disposal to assist you.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've just had one question come in. How would sustainable claims be defined and justified? Well, I'll give you a sentence on it, but I may kick this over to Ian for his comments as well. The issue is that sustainable isn't defined anywhere. And it's one of the things that during that sweep of websites that I was talking about, it was a word that was being bandied around on websites that was said to be misleading. And so that would be my take on that. The problem with that is we don't know what sustainable is in the first place. Whether you want to add anything, Ian?
Well, probably not a lot really, but the point at issue is sustainable means using resources in a way that we leave some resources for future generations. I mean, that's the broad brush definition of sustainability. But it means very different things to different people. And because it's not defined, it's very difficult for you to make a sustainability claim. That's not to say you can't do it, but it would be incredibly difficult to do. And it leads to another point, which follows on a little bit from Rebecca's point there, which is all about aspirational messaging. The difference in aspirational messaging, or we would very much like to do this, or we are going to do this, but actually having very concrete strategies and concrete, almost, documents to prove what it is you want to do and how you propose to get there. So the way I always approach this from a practical perspective is actually when you work with people, you sit down, you say to them, what is it you want to say? And why do you say now you think you can say it? And then you start to drill down, you ask questions, you bat it backwards and forwards to see, well, actually, it may well be true what we're saying, but can we say it in a way that doesn't make it potentially misleading? And it's that sort of second element of that, which is part of the massive problem that we have with these types of claims. We can say something that is true, but when we look at the overall context, it may still make the message misleading. So a lot of the problem, and Hannah's just mentioned it, a lot of the issue with this environmental stuff is actually lack of legislative definition, which in part is why the amendment to the EU directive has had to come in. So it defines what an environmental claim is, a generic environmental claim, all those sort of things. So yeah, it's a difficult one. No reason why you can't consider making it, but you need to look at it in the round in the context of everything else the message is giving to consumers.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. I think we've got off lightly because that's the only question we've got in the question box. So unless there are any other questions, I think we'll finish up. But thank you very much for attending. Hope you found it useful. And if we can assist any of you with anything, please get in touch with us. As I say, we're more than happy to fix up a Teams call, have a chat with you about any issues you've got. So please do just get in touch. Thank you very much.